Master Your Life with Kate McKay. Today, I am very excited to introduce a friend and a person that is a deep inspiration to me, and that is Jon-Paul deLange. Welcome, John.
Hey,
Jon-Paul.
Kate. So great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
I'm grateful. So I'm just going to read your bio, and then we're going to get right on into it. Jon-Paul is actually a 30-year active Army, and with more than 24 deployments. 24. Ooh, everyone get that? 24. Jon-Paul discovered he had PTSD on his own and got treatment and saved his marriage, and found his calling to help other veterans challenged by past traumatic events and turn those events from PTSD into post-traumatic growth opportunities. This is such a huge topic, and I can't wait to get into it.
Awesome. Let's do this.
So 24 deployments. I read that and I was like, my heavens, Jon-Paul. So can you talk about that? Like what? That's a lot of deployments.
Yeah, it is. It's not unusual for our service members, especially those that serve in tactical and operational organizations. So I spent the better part of 1999 in Macedonia and Kosovo when that war happened, was exposed to a lot of ethnic cleansing there and the consequences of that on human society. When 9/11 happened, I was with Army Special Operations at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. I was among the first out the door to the Middle East in response to that event. When the invasion of Iraq happened in 2003, very soon after that, roadside bombs or IEDs started to be the weapon of choice against our soldiers and Marines in combat. And so I got heavily involved with that and stayed involved in that for about 17 years. As a consequence, I was exposed to a lot of the outcomes of what happens when a bomb hits a vehicle and tears it to shreds, and been on many missions in Iraq, resupply missions, route clearance missions. I understand what soldiers experience as a consequence of those kinds of deployments. And, over time, that really hit me, but I didn't really understand how much of an impact it had on me until 11 years after I retired, when I discovered on my own, oh my gosh, I have PTSD. That diagnosis stunned me, but it also opened up the door to a ton of opportunity that I'm anxious to share with other veterans that might be in the same position as me. They're walking around with symptoms that feel normal. They don't know that they have the symptoms, and it's directing the course of their life. It's impacting their relationships. It might be impacting their career, and it certainly is impacting their health and well-being. And we don't know, we can't change what we aren't aware of.
True.
My mission is to create that awareness.
That's quite a noble mission. So can you take us back to that time in your life when you discovered, like, holy crap, that's what this is? Can you describe what your life was like at that point in time?
Sure. Well, a lot of veterans who might be listening to this podcast will most likely be able to identify with pride that they functioned on 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night for extended periods of time, so much that it became habit. And for many years, just until recently, I continued to feel like I thrived on 4 hours of sleep a night, not realizing the physical toll that took on my body. That's, what's insomnia, sleep apnea, all comes from sleep deprivation. And the longer we continue to do that, the more it affects our life. It makes you irritable, moody. I also learned in the combat environments that I operated in to become hypervigilant. For example, when I was in Kosovo and Serbia, we learned to sit facing the door, especially in restaurants, because it wasn't unusual for enemy combatants just to walk into the place and shoot it up or to toss a bomb in there. And so you learn never to face away from the door and always scan the environment for signs of danger. And if you do that enough times repeatedly, it becomes a habit. It's a habit that I have to this day. So these are just some of the symptoms. I have a total of about 14 symptoms related to my PTSD that I had no idea. They felt totally normal, and they feel normal to people. It's just a consequence of the environments that we're in, the pace of life, the operational tempo that we work in, and the habits that we form, that we don't even realize that we have these symptoms or that we can do something about it to improve the quality of our life. So it was through an argument that I was having with my wife back in 2018 that we noticed a pattern. And I was working in a field called radical forgiveness at the time. I made good use of radical forgiveness to dissolve some of the painful memories of my life in the past. And so in combination of those two things, I was triggered. I understood what triggers meant and how they happened. And I was triggered one day, and we decided it's time for me to get checked out. And lo and behold, a short time later, I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. Surprised the heck out of me.
No doubt.
Finally, I started getting answers to some of life's questions that I was asking for years and years, and started to understand how that affected the most important parts of my life and started to do something about it. And so here I am today.
So when you talk about that time, and I love that you've reached a place where you're on top of that story, that you can look at that from perspective and say, wow, that was a pivotal point for me, that I learned a lot about myself and I was able to build a better relationship. And I was better, obviously this radical forgiveness program is a really instrumental piece of that. But what would you say, what was your experience emotionally prior to that awareness?
Yeah, I was really isolated and disconnected, both from myself and the world around me. When you're hypervigilant and you're always on guard and irritable, and you don't get enough sleep, the world around you feels like a threat. And you just learn to adapt to the environment you're in. And that has a direct correlation to your quality of life. Not only yours, but the most important people that you surround yourself with. In my case, it was my wife and my family. But it showed up at work too. Before I was diagnosed, I lost 2 jobs as a consequence of, some triggers that happened at work. And it was just not a good existence. It's a function of feeling like you belong. And for many years, I didn't feel like I quite belonged, that there was something going on that I couldn't put my finger on, until I was able to discover what the source of it was.
So was there anything, because you said that it was something like you felt isolated and disconnected, and distant from not just yourself, but for others around you, and that it's the maladaption of seeing your environment as the enemy. So because you and I are both high performance coaches and we met in the coaching field, how much of that seeing the environment around you as the enemy, was that also directed actually from an own feelings of that you were your own enemy?
Yeah, you bet. Kate, that's an excellent question. Everybody wants to be understood, valued, respected, and appreciated. I had a hard time fitting in wherever I would go. Inevitably, the symptoms of my PTSD would show up. And it's important, if I just pause for a second, to say post-traumatic stress trauma is just a wound. It's a wound that imprints itself on our nervous system, and then it shows up again and again in unhelpful ways. Most of us don't realize that. Trauma has been so stigmatized in our society. And as high performance coaches, I know we both try to get to know our clients on a very deep level. And if we can uncover those kinds of symptoms and those kinds of ideas and beliefs that our clients work with, why, that's a reflection of ourselves as well, and presents opportunities for growth and healing, most of all, from the things that hold us back to living at higher levels.
Totally. So what would you say if the veterans listening and people that love veterans and maybe people who are just not aware, when you're in that hypervigilant state for so long, and many of those, it's like being the wolf, like always. And I noticed you and I, when we had coffee, you were facing the door. Now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah. So when we're thinking about that time of hypervigilance, how does that negatively affect your self-identity And why do you think forgiveness, as a second part of the question, is so key in the place of moving into a place of self-loathing, self-doubt, self-hatred, whatever that is, as a reflection of what is your environment is you? That's the, it's just oftentimes that's the truth. And then moving into this place of forgiveness, and why is that so pivotal?
Yeah, and self-protection. When just take hypervigilance, for example. When I was at the coffee shop, this happens so unconsciously, you're just not aware of it. Once it becomes a habit, I'm constantly scanning my environment. And that is to say, everything speeds up in my body, and my nervous system is working overtime to detect threats in the environment. That was a perfectly safe place for us to have that meeting, and that's normal. But if we're trained to be hypervigilant, we're in a state, our nervous system is in a state called fight or flight. And if we think there's a threat in the environment, we could even drop down into freeze and collapse. And that's where we're just not functioning. We're totally isolated from our environment, and that's just not a healthy way to live your day-to-day life. So finding radical forgiveness happened by accident. My wife was on a run and texted me saying, listening to Colin Tipping, and she texted me saying, "You've got to listen to this." And so when I did, I discovered a pathway to recognizing some of my symptoms and how they were affecting the quality of my life. And radical forgiveness is kind of, I call it an advanced form of forgiveness. It's not a traditional type of forgiveness by any means, but it helped me go deep inside of myself to recognize the narrative that I created as a consequence of taking on these symptoms of traumatic stress. And that narrative for me was a false narrative that became my identity. That's why when I go into restaurants, I still face the door. It's a habit. It became my identity. And if you can recognize the false narrative that you create for yourself in your life, you can change it. You can figure out what the core beliefs are behind that, and you can shift those beliefs into something that's more aligned with who you really are. And that's really the first step toward dropping your baggage from the past and leveling up your life to make yourself ready for something like high performance habits.
Yeah, right on. So when we're looking at core beliefs, oftentimes that's the unraveling. And I think that it's the biggest pivot where we're going to experience the biggest transformation in our lives. And much of that is just having someone mirror your language or hear the way you're speaking of yourself or your stories that you keep rewinding and replaying. And then someone hearing it, or you hearing it by journaling or speaking it, and then someone asking you, is that true? And oh man, that is life-changing. And we grip on to these false beliefs because they become a blanket of safety, even if we're self-destructing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why, if you're in a meaningful relationship, a relationship that's meaningful for you, it helps both people, for both of you to be engaged in this journey of healing, to help understand each other more. And through that understanding, we learn to value each other more and appreciate the journey we're on, and actually help each other by reminding each other when we get triggered, hey, is something happening? Slow down, scan the environment, know that you're safe here with me. Let's talk about this, what's coming up for you. And often we're triggered, our environment triggers in us a reminder of something that happened in our past that was traumatic to us, but our body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And so it always defaults back to safety, keeping you safe, making sure you survive. And this whole process of radical forgiveness and then somatic experiencing, which I got into after my diagnosis, is all about re-regulating the nervous system to become more aware that the environment we're in doesn't have as many threats as we might think it has. And by practicing that, we start to slow our nervous system down and become more attuned to our environment so that we can respond to it in a way that's less destructive and more constructive.
So powerful. So you and I bonded at an event, and in particular, we I think have a very similar perspective on this experience of post-traumatic transformation, the possibility of actually transforming through trauma and grief. And I think that being a person, me as a mom, losing a son to suicide, it opens up a portal of healing that's possible if we're courageous enough to, yes, forgive others, forgive my son for making a decision that basically blew up my life and my other children's life and my family and everyone around him, but also understanding he had free will. His name was Will. And that also understanding that the process of forgiveness is, yes, forgiving people around us, but also more deeply forgiving ourselves for feeling as though we were a victim of a situation, and also forgiving ourselves for hoping that things would often be different than they are. And that radical acceptance, radical forgiveness really is pivotal. And I will say, when we are and we embrace this new way, the power of transformation through grief and loss and trauma, the people around us are oftentimes very uncomfortable, because we're exposing maybe their belief systems that they want to continue to hang on to because it gives them comfort, even if it's suffering. And I would love you to just talk on that point. And how was that for you when you started speaking out about post-traumatic stress in an environment, Jon-Paul, that was not encouraged at all as you were in the Army?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Kate, first, thank you for your book. It's such a moving piece of work, and I was moved to read about your son. I was there too. I entertained thoughts of suicide when I was at my lowest point in my life. I think the only thing that saved me was my love of life, that no matter how bad or hard life gets, there's something to look forward to. I think that's the one thing that saved me. I felt your anguish, but I applaud your courage for the way you got through it. And you hit the nail on the head. A big part of that kind of an experience is learning to forgive ourselves for the judgment that we pile on ourselves. What could we have done differently? What could I have said that would have made the difference? And we often forget we're all on our own journey to learn here what a lesson that we're meant to learn. And a big part of the radical forgiveness journey and my journey through PTSD is recognizing life happens for us and not to us. We are not victims. And so foundational lesson of radical forgiveness is you're not a victim in this life. You're here to learn something. We're all spiritual beings in a human body having a human experience, here to learn to reconnect with our true selves. And so, when I got my diagnosis, I frankly didn't care too much what other people thought, especially because answers to questions I asked all my life about life and how to live it were suddenly coming to me, and I wanted to share that with others. So in my workplace, I talked with very, very senior leaders, many of them, and I shared with them openly. I have PTSD. I'd really like to talk more about it. And down the line, I noticed a lack of understanding, a lack of curiosity, just not knowing how to respond when somebody is so open and forthright about what's affecting them. And I didn't talk about it in a way to say, hey, feel sorry for me. I talked about it as, hey, I have this. I'm starting to recognize how the environment in this workplace affects it, and I can recognize it at home. I think this is a story worth telling. I think it's education worth having so that we can know each other better, recognize those signs when they show up, and know how to respond to them in a constructive way. People that are traumatized, sometimes they do terrible things, and it's because they're in deep personal pain. I believe people that have addictions it's all about numbing the pain. Getting into relationships that they shouldn't be getting into is all about finding a way to belong. It's not always constructive, but through practicing modalities like radical forgiveness or infinite possibilities or high performance habits, we can train ourselves to change our mindset and really enter into a better way of living than we ever thought was possible, even with our PTSD. That's not a life sentence for us. We can level up even if we're living with the symptoms. It's how much we allow them to control our day-to-day activities and our decisions. That's the key.
So true. Love that. Oh gosh. So what was the challenge for you then? And the book Claim Your Inner Warrior, the book that I wrote is for men, especially for men and the women and the people who love them. So much of being able to talk authentically or having the courage to speak the truth on your experience is uncomfortable for a lot of men. And now we're thinking about this. Now we're putting it in the military environment, in a very male-dominated in general environment. First of all, I want to applaud you for the courage in being able to have that level of commitment and tenacity and grit and heart to step into a space that truly wants you silenced, Jon-Paul. It's just a huge deal. I feel very deeply about it. So what is that for you that drives you, that you are so committed to ensure that this conversation happens, Jon-Paul? Why? What is it for you?
Yeah, because, what stays in the shadows gets worse. It doesn't get better. It's an old saying, but it's true here. Problems don't get better with time. They don't get better by ignoring them. And so, this is a difficult problem. Service members, the military is there to win wars and preserve our way of life. It's a difficult conversation in that environment and a difficult balance to strike between achieving the mission of why we're there and making sure that our mental well-being is part of that winning formula. And so I don't have all the answers, but one thing I do know, you can't change what you aren't aware of. And so awareness is the first step. And the only way that we can achieve more awareness of the effects that trauma has on ourselves as individuals, on our families, on our communities, and in our society writ large is by talking about it, by taking it into the mainstream to talk about it, because a lot of stigmas associated with post-traumatic stress are all about not understanding what it is. And we fear what we don't understand. We isolate more. We push away what we don't understand. And that, in this case, just makes the problem worse. I believe PTSD is an epidemic in our society. All we need to do is hear about the latest mass shooting to know more people are now traumatized. More people will develop PTSD from that experience. And PTSD was probably part of that incident before it even ever happened. So until we bring mental health and mental wellness, well-being into the mainstream and make it as a common, accepted topic of conversation as when we sprain our ankle, we won't be able to see the change that we can make if we dedicate ourselves to it.
Interested in learning more about a mastermind with Kate McKay? Reach out to us on our website at kate-mckay.com.
You said the word preservation. When we think about preserving, that's the job of the military, right? In many ways, that's such a powerful word. And preservation is an interesting word, only because you think of something, to preserve something is to seal it and to, not to make it airtight, right? You preserve art and you preserve your safety. And so it's really hermetically sealed kind of thing, right? So then to make it, what does it mean to be able to have these conversations in a environment, both the military and in our culture, particularly in the male culture, of preserving your dignity, your respect, and your honor, and yet still being able to speak your truth, live transparently, and be courageous in speaking your truth and your needs. That doesn't necessarily fit into the paradigm of the word preservation.
Yeah, not the current one. I would agree with that. But look, it's not. We've got to agree that it's not a sign of weakness to talk about it. It's not a sign of weakness to have the symptoms.
Did you feel like it was, Jon-Paul?
I think when I tried to raise awareness among the senior leaders of the organization I worked in and saw how uncomfortable some of them were to hear that news, I wondered, did I do the right thing by telling them? But I don't regret it. It just highlighted there's more work to do. And so, for the men that read your book, it makes very clear to be your authentic self, you've got to be vulnerable. You can't experience the best of life that it has to offer without being vulnerable. And to be vulnerable means to talk about what's going on inside of you with someone you can trust and someone that's receptive. And the more we do that, I think the better we grow as a society.
I think it's also too, and I love the way our mentor coach, Brendan Bouchard, talks about vulnerability. He says assertive vulnerability. I love those words together. And why I love it so much is it gives you power in your asserting what it is that you choose to share and what you choose that you need. And it also indicates that we can say no to things, right? We can assert who we are. That means we're putting out our needs and our wants. But it also doesn't mean we're just vulnerable. And I think a lot of men hear that word vulnerable and it triggers them. I don't really care for the word in and of itself and the way that it's used in our culture because it's very feminized. So how do we talk about vulnerability, Jon-Paul, in a way that men resonate with that and understand and can feel comfortable with? Because I think that in our culture, we feminize so much of our communication style. And this is a woman saying that. But I have 5 brothers, been in a gym forever. And I believe that we feminize a lot of conversations that men are expected to function within, which I believe very wholeheartedly decreases their ability to be authentic and to assert what their needs are. Me personally, I believe that. Do you share that belief? And if so, I'm curious on ways that we can talk about this conversation of vulnerability in a way that will resonate with men in particular.
Oh, that's such a great question. I'm a Leo, so I don't care too much what other people say or think about me. So I don't mind putting myself out there, but I know that's not
You're very unusual.
I think so. Yes. Yes. And I know you can relate to that as well. Our emotions are just a part of who we are. We're taught from a very young age to sort of ignore that part of ourselves. But if we really think about it, how much sense does that really make to cut yourself off from half of who you are, to deprive yourself of a resource that can guide you in your life if you learn how to use it? And so many of us are afraid to overuse it or to be run by it. And it doesn't have to be that way. I love Brendan's use of the term assertive vulnerability. It means that you're living your life on purpose, that you know how to listen to your emotions, allow them to guide you and into making informed decisions so that you live with a greater sense of aliveness, so that you know how to deepen your connections with others. And you use your emotions as a resource to help you grow. It doesn't have to be an outburst of emotions as much as just an indicator. Hey, something feels right, something doesn't feel right. Allow that to inform my next step and then my next one. And it takes practice. All we have to start, we start with baby steps. And as we gain comfortability and confidence in letting our emotions guide us in how we make decisions and how we view the world around us, we get better at it. You know, we attract more of what we really want out of life and the people we really want to surround ourselves with. That coaching summit we attended together where we first met was an enormously positive and energetic environment of like-minded people. Those are the kind of people I want to surround myself with.
Absolutely, because they're the leaders in this.
Yes.
So I have a question for you in regards to post-traumatic stress, because it seems that people have judgment even around that. About how could you have post-traumatic stress? You never fought. You weren't in the front line. What do you mean you have post-traumatic stress? Can you talk about that? Because it seems that there is a level that people think, oh, you couldn't have PTSD because you didn't blank. Is that true or an untruth?
It's such a common thought. I thought it myself, which is why I was so surprised with my diagnosis. I never engaged the enemy in combat. I was in plenty of combat environments. You know, I was on the receiving end of mortars when I was in Baghdad, you know, when I was in some pretty hairy situations a couple of times, but I never fired my weapon at anybody. And as a consequence of that, I thought this could never happen to me. Only people that engage in direct combat can get PTSD, but that's just not true. You know, sexual assault is another means of developing post-traumatic stress. Getting into a serious accident or living through a natural disaster is another way of getting PTSD. Then there are also secondary forms of getting PTSD, which is, kind of the things that I was exposed to, the ravages of war, seeing American blood spilt on vehicles that had been blown up, witnessing the consequences of ethnic cleansing, seeing starvation and poverty in other parts of the world. That has had an effect on me. Certainly the way I was raised as a child, being the son of parents that were kids during World War II. My mother was in a Japanese concentration camp. My dad was a boy in Holland growing up, seeing the Germans do terrible things to people. They didn't have access to resources like we have now. So they passed their pain on to me, and that developed within me. And it will continue to do that for everybody on the planet until somebody comes along and says, enough, no more. I need to understand this better. And for me, I learned the source of my PTSD was primarily secondary, as I explained, being exposed to so many different things. But, whether it's primary or secondary, the effects in our body and on our mind are exactly the same. And so the healing process is exactly the same. Some have it worse than others, certainly, but the process of healing is exactly the same. And the opportunities for growth and achieving higher levels of living are certainly available to everyone, regardless of the source of their traumatic stress.
Could you provide us hope? When we're thinking of PTSD, it's a sentence in some ways to people that if they accept that, oh my gosh, everything that I've seen and done and been through, I will fall apart. I will no longer be able to preserve my sense of who I am anymore if I admit that. And what is the pathway, the journey to a deeper level of healing, and even may we say a transformative experience?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Kate, because it's exactly what I went through too. And look, I learned very, very early, PTSD, traumatic stress, trauma in general is not a life sentence. And so many veterans out there believe either it's a life sentence or they fool themselves into thinking other people had it worse than I did. So, I don't want to complain. Look, if the bottom line is this, if you have symptoms of traumatic stress, you owe it to yourselves to do something about it. If you don't want to do something about it for yourself, do it for the people that love you, because they're struggling and suffering from it too, by the way it shows up in you and you're in their interactions with you. For me, the path was such a blessing, was an amazing series of events that started with radical forgiveness, where I learned to recognize the narrative I had created for myself as a consequence of being traumatized, dissolving that narrative and replacing it with a new narrative and set of beliefs that were more congruent with who I am, and then learning how to visualize my future, to get myself out of a pattern of living that just didn't serve me or set me up for the kinds of success and the type of life that I really, really wanted to have for myself. And so I met Mike Dooley, the founder of Infinite Possibilities, and learned that process and got certified in that modality. And then Brendan Burchard came into my life at the perfect time, where I was asking, okay, I've dissolved all this painful energy around my false narrative through radical forgiveness. How can I replace these old beliefs and habits that have not been serving me for a long time with new ones? And here comes Brendan Burchard to teach the high performance habits. And they have made a remarkable difference in my life, so much that I have combined all three modalities. And I want to get the word out there to anybody that will listen. Your life can be extraordinary. And I want that for you. I want you to have what I had. You can see the happiness and joy on my face. It wasn't always there. And it's attainable. It's achievable if we're willing to do the work and make the investment in ourselves. It starts with ourselves. And once we start investing in ourselves, we start attracting the kinds of things and people in our life that raise it to higher levels of joy and happiness and fulfillment and success. And I want that for everybody.
So good. So is that your why?
I think it's my why. I really, truly believe we have an opportunity, work with me and you can turn your PTSD into post-traumatic growth opportunities. People don't put those two together as a natural kind of connection of words. But I believe having post-traumatic stress is an opportunity. There's so much opportunity behind our traumatic stress to create growth for ourselves and achieve things that we that we might not ever have believed were possible for us. But I know it is. And that's why I believe I put my heart and soul into this mission, because I know it can make a difference in many, many people's lives.
So good. I was thinking about this like the first time we met, and in some ways you have you're very dignified, and you have this really powerful, very powerful energy. And right off the bat, you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily how heart-centered you are and how loving you are. And I just want to thank you for coming into the world and being courageous enough to lean into this work and have this conversation, and the willingness to open your heart and your mind and share your gifts so that you can help others see hope and possibility in their future self, when so many people do not see it for themselves.
We need it today more than ever, Kate. I think I believe that. You can't heal what you don't feel. And so, that journey is a journey that's worth taking. It's not always easy, but there are so many gifts waiting for us if you're willing to go through the experience instead of around it. Your life changes in a heartbeat.
So what do you want any viewer listening to know in this moment, Jon-Paul?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you've been diagnosed and you aren't getting treatment, get treatment. It works. It's available to you, especially if you're a veteran. Contact the National Center for PTSD through the VA, and you'll see all the services that are available out there. If you think you might have some of the symptoms of PTSD, but you haven't been diagnosed, I've got a checklist. You can go right out to my website, and I think it's in the narrative that I shared with you, Kate. You can download that checklist and just answer a few questions in less than 10 minutes. You'll have an indication of whether you might have some of the symptoms. And if you do, go get yourself checked out. It's a life-changing experience to get yourself diagnosed. It's not something to be afraid of. It's something to embrace, because therein lies the pathway to better living. And then
to ultimate freedom too.
Ultimate freedom.
We're going to ring the word, which isn't that our highest calling? What motivates most people? And you thinking about the fighting for freedom of the military, right? That's really the conviction, right? To help people feel free. And I would say that if you're listening, that you deserve to feel free within, so that you can live with a clearer sense of purpose and meaning.
It's the ultimate reward that life has to offer us, Kate, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And in my view, nobody deserves it more than our men and women who served our country in uniform. They deserve the best quality of life that we can possibly give them, and they can create for themselves. So I'm excited to share that with you and the world around us.
So wonderful. I absolutely will be sharing in the show notes the checklist that Jon-Paul's offering. And Jon-Paul, again, I just want to thank you for bringing all of you to this time together. And I'm deeply grateful for our time to meet. And I am also really looking forward to supporting you on your mission, our mission of bringing light to dark places for all people.
So good to be with you, Kate. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all the viewers and listeners of Master Your Life with Kate McKay. I am looking forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Until then, be courageous, assert your vulnerability, embrace what's uniquely you. And until next time, go be great.
Want to learn more about Kate? Check out our website at kate-mckay.com.